Hello guys. So I'm back today with chapter 2. Where we left off in chapter 1 was Winston was writing in his journal and he was writing down with Big Brother and then he heard a knock at the door. So that's where we're just going to pick up at. So chapter 2. As he put his hands to the doorknob, Winston saw that he had left the diary open on the table. Down with Big Brother was written all over it and letters almost big enough to be legible across the room. It was an inconceivably stupid thing to have done. But, he realized, even in his panic he had not wanted to smudge the creamy paper by shutting the book while the ink was wet. He drew in his breath and opened the door. Instantly a warm wave of relief flowed through him. A colorless, crushed-looking woman with wispy hair and a lined face was standing outside. "Oh, comrade," she began in a dreary, whining sort of voice. "I thought I heard you come in. Didn't you think you'd come across and have a look at our kitchen sink? It's got blocked up and—" It was Mrs. Parsons, the wife of a neighbor on the same floor. Mrs. was a word somewhat discountenanced by the party. You were supposed to call everyone comrade, but with some women one used it instinctively. She was a woman of about 30, but looking much older. One had the impression that there was dust in the creases of her face. Winston followed her down the passage. These amateur repair jobs were an almost daily irritation. Victory mansions were old flats built in 1930 or thereabouts and were falling to pieces. The plaster flaked constantly from ceilings and walls. The pipes burst in every hard frost. The roof leaked whenever there was snow. The heating system was usually running at half steam when it was not closed down altogether from motives of economy. Repairs, except what you could do for yourself, had to be sanctioned by remote committees, which were liable to hold up even the mending of a window pane for 2 years. "Of course it's only because Tom isn't home," said Miss Parsons vaguely. The Parsons flat was bigger than Winston's and dingy in a different way. Everything had a battered, trampled-on look, as though the place had just been visited by some large, violent animals. Games impedimenta, hockey sticks, boxing gloves, a burst football, a pair of sweaty shorts turned inside out, lay all over the floor, and on the table was a litter of dirty dishes and dog-eared exercise books. On the walls were scarlet banners of the Youth League and the Spies, and a full-size poster of Big Brother. There was the usual boiled cabbage smell, common to the whole building, but it was shot through by a sharper reek of sweat, which, one knew this at the first sniff, though it was hard to say how, was the sweat of some person not present at the moment. So like stale sweat. So like somebody was sweating and just left the smell in the room. That's nasty. In another room, someone with a comb and a piece of toilet paper was trying to keep tune with the military music which was still issuing from the telescreen. "It's the children," said Mrs. Parsons, casting a half-apprehensive glance at the door. "They haven't been out today, and of course—" She had a habit of breaking off her sentences in the middle. The kitchen sink was full nearly to the brim with filthy greenish water, which smelt worse than ever of cabbage. Winston knelt down and examined the angle joint of the pipe. He hated using his hands, and he hated bending down, which was always liable to start him coughing. Mrs. Parsons looked on helplessly. Of course, if Tom was home, Of course, if Tom was home, he'd put it right in a moment, she said. "He loves anything like that. He's ever so good with his hands, Tom is." Parsons was Winston's fellow employee at the Ministry of Truth. He was a fattish but active man of paralyzing stupidity. A mass of imbecile enthusiasms. One of those completely unquestioning, devoted drudges on whom more even than on the thought police, the stability of the party depended. At 35, he had just been unwillingly evicted from the Youth League, and before graduating into the Youth League, he had managed to stay in on the Spies for a year beyond the statutory age. At the ministry, he was employed in some subordinate post for which intelligence was not required, but on the other hand, he was a leading figure on the sports committee and all the other committees engaged in organizing community hikes, spontaneous demonstrations, saving campaigns, and voluntary activity generally. So basically, he's called this man a fat dummy who is all for the party and organizes sports events. That's messed up. But hey, that's what he is. He would inform me with quiet pride between whiffs of his pipe that he had put in an appearance at the community center every evening for the past 4 years. An overpowering smell of sweat, a sort of unconscious testimony to the strenuousness of his life, followed him about whenever he went, and even remained behind him after he had gone. "Have you got a spanner?" said Winston, fiddling with the nut on the angle joint. "A spanner," said Mrs. Parsons, immediately becoming invertebrate. "I don't know, I'm sure. Perhaps the children." There was a trampling of boots and another blast on the comb as the children charged into the living room. Mrs. Parsons brought the spanner. Winston let out the water and disgustedly removed the clot of human hair that had blocked up the pipe. He cleaned his fingers as best as he could in the cold water from the tap and went back into the other room. "Up with your hands!" yelled a savage voice. A handsome, tough-looking boy of 9 had popped up from behind the table and was menacing him with a toy automatic pistol, while his small sister, about 2 years younger, made the same gesture with a fragment of wood. Both of them were dressed in the blue shorts, gray shirts, and red neckerchiefs, which were the uniform of the spies. Winston raised his hands above his head, and with an uneasy feeling, so vicious was the boy's demeanor that it was not altogether a game. "You're a traitor," yelled the boy. "You're a thought criminal. You're a Eurasian spy. I'll shoot you. I'll vaporize you. I'll send you to the salt mines." Suddenly they were both leaping around him, shouting, "Traitor!" and "Thought criminal!" the little girl imitating her brother in every movement. It was somehow slightly frightening, like the gambling of tiger cubs which will soon grow up into man-eaters. There was a sort of calculating ferocity in the boy's eye, a quite evident desire to hit or kick Winston, and a consciousness of being very nearly big enough to do so. So basically, these some little YNs. That's basically what they are. Like, that's crazy. Not they popped out pretending to hold up guns. Like, you know what I'm saying? It was a good job it was not a real pistol he was holding, Winston thought. Mrs. Parsons' eyes flitted nervously from Winston to the children and back again. In the better light of the living room, he noticed with interest that there was actually dust in the creases of her face. "They do get so noisy," she said. "They're disappointed because they couldn't go to see the hanging. That's what it is. I'm too busy to take them, and Tom won't be back from work in time." "Why can't we go and see the hanging?" roared the boy in his huge voice. "We want to see the hanging! We want to see the hanging!" chanted the little girl, still capering around. Some Eurasian prisoners guilty of war crimes were to be hanged in the park that evening, Winston remembered. This happened about once a month and was a popular spectacle. Children always clamored to be taken to see it. He took his leave of Miss Parsons and made for the door. But he had not gone 6 steps down the passage when something hit the back of his neck, an agonizingly painful blow. It was as though a red-hot wire had been jabbed into him. He spun around just in time to see Mrs. Parsons dragging her son back into the doorway while the boy pocketed a catapult. "Goldstein!" bellowed the boy as the door closed on him. But what most struck Winston was the look of helpless fright on the woman's grave face. Back in the flat, he stepped quickly past the telescreen and sat down at the table again, still rubbing his neck. The music from the telescreen had stopped. Instead, a clipped military voice was reading out, with a sort of brutal relish, a description of the armaments of the new floating fortress, which had just been anchored between Iceland and the Faroe Islands. With those children, he thought, that wretched woman must lead a life of terror. Another year, 2 years, and they would be watching her night and day for symptoms of unorthodoxy. Nearly all children nowadays were horrible. What was worst of all was that by means of such organizations as the spies, they were systematically turned into ungovernable little savages, and yet this produced in them no tendency whatever to rebel against the discipline of the party. On the contrary, they adored the party and everything connected with it. The songs, the processions, the banners, the hiking, the drilling with dummy rifles, the yelling of slogans, the worship of Big Brother. It was all a sort of glorious game to them. All their ferocity was turned outwards against the enemies of the state, against foreigners, traitors, saboteurs, thought criminals. It was almost normal for people over 30 to be frightened of their own children, and with good reason, for hardly a week passed in which the Times did not carry a paragraph describing how some eavesdropping little sneak, child hero was the phrase generally used, had overheard some compromising remark and denounced his parents to the thought police. So basically, these kids are really like little spies. If they even hear their parents utter a small thing that they don't agree with Big Brother, the kids will turn them into the police, the thought police, and their parents can literally vanish. That's why when the kids out and doing all that little running around and pretending to be like the little thought police, the mom was looking crazy because she's like, this is what I deal with every day. Like, I'm worried in my own house. If I say something wrong, they're going to go to the police and tell them that I said something wrong, and then I could disappear. That's crazy. Like, you got to watch out for your own children in your own house. In your own house. The people that you birthed. The sting of the catapult bullet had worn off. He picked up his pen half-heartedly, wondering whether he could find something more to write in the diary. Suddenly he began thinking of O'Brien again. Years ago, how long was it? 7 years it must be. He had dreamed that he was walking through a pitch-dark room, and someone was sitting to one side of him, and someone sitting to one side of him had said as he passed, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." It was said very quietly, almost casually, a statement, not a command. He had walked on without pausing. What was curious was that at the time, in the dream, the words had not made much impression on him. It was only later, and by degrees, that they had seemed to take on significance. He could not now remember whether it was before or after having the dream that he had seen O'Brien for the first time, nor could he remember when he had first identified the voice as O'Brien's. But at any rate, the identification existed. It was O'Brien who had spoken to him out of the dark. Winston had never been able to feel sure. Even after this morning's flash of the eyes, it was still impossible to be sure whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy. Nor did it even seem to matter greatly. There was a link of understanding between them more important than affection or partisanship. "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness," he had said. Winston did not know what it meant, only that in some way or another it would come true. The voice from the telescreen paused. A trumpet call, clear and beautiful, floated into the stagnant air. The voice continued raspingly, "Attention! Your attention, please! A news flash has this moment arrived from the Malabar front. Our forces in South India have won a glorious victory. I am authorized to say that the action we are now reporting may well bring the war within measurable distance of its end. Here is the news flash." Bad news coming, thought Winston, and sure enough, following on a gory description of the annihilation of a Eurasian army with stupendous figures of killed and prisoners, came the announcement that, as from next week, the chocolate ration would be reduced from 30 grams to 20. Winston belched again. The gin was wearing off, leaving a deflated feeling. The telescreen, perhaps to celebrate the victory, perhaps to drown the memory of the lost chocolate, crashed into Oceana, "'Tis for thee." You were supposed to stand to attention, however, in this present position, he was invisible. So it's basically like the national anthem for them. "Oceana, 'tis for thee." That's so ugly. I wonder how it goes. "Oceana, 'tis for thee" gave way to lighter music. Winston walked over to the window, keeping his back to the telescreen. The day was still cold and clear. Somewhere far away, a rocket bomb exploded with a dull, reverberating roar. About 20 or 30 of them a week were falling on London at present. Down in the street, the wind flapped a torn poster to and fro. The word Ingsoc fitfully appeared and vanished. Ingsoc. The sacred principles of Ingsoc. Newspeak, doublespeak, the mutability of the past. He felt as though he were wandering in the forest of the sea bottom, lost in a monstrous world where he himself was the monster. He was alone. The past was dead. The future was unimaginable. What certainty had he that a single human creature now living was on his side? And what way of knowing that the dominion of the party would not endure forever? Like an answer, the three slogans on the white face of the Ministry of Truth came back at him. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. He took a 25-cent piece out of his pocket. There, too, in tiny clear lettering, the same slogans were inscribed, and on the other face of the coin, the head of Big Brother. So basically, he took out a quarter, and instead of a quarter being like, you know how we have quarters now, and it says like, "In God we trust" on one side, like an eagle, and then you flip it, and it's like the face of whatever president's on the quarter. It's Big Brother on one side, and then the slogan of war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength on the other side. Even from the coin, the eyes pursued you. On coins, on stamps, on the covers of books, on banners, on posters, and on the wrapping of a cigarette packet. Everywhere. Always the eyes watching you and the voice enveloping you. Asleep or awake, working or eating, indoors or out of doors, in the bath or in bed, no escape. Nothing was your own except the few cubic centimeters. Nothing was your own except the few cubic centimeters inside your skull. The sun had shifted round, and the myriad windows of the Ministry of Truth, with the light no longer shining on them, looked grim as the loopholes of a fortress. His heart quailed before the enormous pyramidal shape. It was too strong. It could not be stormed. 1,000 rocket bombs would not batter it down. He wondered again for whom he was writing the diary. For the future, for the past, for an age that might be imaginary. And in front of him there lay not death, but annihilation. The diary would be reduced to ashes and himself to vapor. Only the thought police would read what he had written, before they wiped it out of existence and out of memory. How could you make an appeal to the future when not a trace of you, not even an anonymous word scribbled on a piece of paper, could physically survive? The telescreen struck 14. He must leave in 10 minutes. He had to be back at work by 14:30. Curiously, the chiming of the hour seeming to have put new heart into him. He was a lonely ghost uttering a truth that nobody would ever hear. But so long as he uttered it, in some obscure way, the continuity was not broken. It was not by making yourself heard, but by staying sane, that you carried on the human heritage. He went back to the table, dipped his pen, and wrote, "To the future or to the past, to a time when thought is free, when men are different from one another and do not live alone, to a time when truth exists and what is done cannot be undone. From the age of uniformity, from the age of solitude, from the age of Big Brother, from the age of doublethink. Greetings." He was already dead, he reflected. It seemed to him that it was only now, when he had begun to be able to formulate his thoughts, that he had taken the decisive step. The consequences of every act are included in the act itself. He wrote, "Thought crime does not entail death. Thought crime is death." Now that he had recognized himself as a dead man, it became important to stay alive as long as possible. 2 fingers of his right hand were ink-stained. It was exactly the kind of detail that might betray you. Some nosing zealot in the ministry, a woman, probably someone like the little sandy-haired woman, or the dark-haired girl from the fiction department, might start wondering why he had been writing during the lunch interval, why he had used an old-fashioned pen, what he had been writing, and then drop a hint in the appropriate quarter. He went to the bathroom and carefully scrubbed the ink away in the gritty, dark brown soap which rasped your skin like sandpaper, and was therefore well adapted for his purpose. He put the diary away in the drawer. It was quite useless to think of hiding it, but he could at least make sure whether or not its existence had been discovered. A hair laid across the page ends was too obvious. With the tip of his finger, he picked up an identifiable grain of whitish dust and deposited it onto the corner of the book, where it was bound to be shaken off if the book was moved. So basically, he's already come to the conclusion that he's just like, yeah, I'm not of this party of Big Brother. I'm with the Goldstein guy. Like, I don't agree with the war is peace, freedom is slavery, and it's just strength. And he's already, like, wrote down Big Brother so many times, he just comes to the conclusion, like, that's just what it has to be for him. Like, he's not going to keep conforming to this version of society that is harmful to everything. And then even with the kids being how they are, like little spies who spy on their parents, and, you know what I'm saying, you already got the screens watching you, now you got your kids watching you. It's like, what can you really do in this society? You can't even do anything. You can't say anything that you think, because you will literally just get snatched up into thin air, and it'll be like you never existed. And so for him, he's like, yeah, like we said, he's already dead. because it's like, I'm just gonna keep writing this diary. Like, if it makes it to the future, it makes it to somebody, then that's great. But at this point, he's like, I'm just gonna keep going because I just don't want to keep conforming to this version of reality. This is not reality to me. And even like when the news came on, and they was like, attention, like, we have great news, and he's like, this is bad news. Like, y'all over here killing people and all this stuff because they don't agree with what y'all say. Like, that's not good news. Like, that's bad news. And then even like with his diary, when he was putting it up at the end, he couldn't even put a piece of hair on the diary to see if it was moved, because that would be too noticeable. And somebody would be like, why you got this right here? Or even him just using a regular pen. He's like, I can't even use a regular pen because they'll see the ink on my hands, and then I can get snatched up because of that. Because then they'll be like, oh, so why was you using a pen? What was you writing? What made you even want to write? You know what I'm saying? Like, all in his business. All because he had ink on his fingers. That's crazy that people really pay that much attention or even look that deep into what he has going on, to where him... I lost a nail. To where him having ink on his hands will do something like that. Oh, we talking about hands. There we go. So he had to put like a little piece of dust on the book in order for it to, if anybody moved it, he could see if they moved it. But I feel like if they moved the book, then they would just take him. Like, they not about to just move your book and put it back. No, they gonna move your book and then come move you. The fuck? Like, at this rate, if this how hard they going for everything, you think putting some dust on the book is really gonna make them be like, oh, let me put the book back so he doesn't know we're here. No, bro, they gonna be waiting in your apartment to snatch you up so you get in there. You're not even gonna know if the book is moved, because they gonna take you. Whew. Since we still got time, we're just gonna get into chapter 3, since we're already here. And I'm already here. And I actually like reading this book. It's getting good to me. Chapter 3. Winston was dreaming of his mother. He must, he thought, have been 10 or 11 years old when his mother had disappeared. She was a tall, statuesque, rather silent woman, with slow movements and magnificent fair hair. His father, he remembered more vaguely, as dark and thin, dressed always in neat dark clothes. Winston remembered especially the very thin soles of his father's shoes, and wearing spectacles. The two of them must evidently have been swallowed up in one of the first great purges of the 50s. At that moment, his mother was sitting in some place deep down beneath him, with his younger sister in her arms. He did not remember his sister at all, except as a tiny, feeble baby, always silent, with large, watchful eyes. Both of them were looking up at him. They were down in some subterranean place, the bottom of a well, for instance, or a very deep grave. But it was a place which, already far below him, was itself moving downwards. They were in the saloon of a sinking ship, looking up at him through the darkening water. There was still air in the saloon. They could still see him, but all the while they were sinking down into the green waters which in another moment must hide them from sight forever. He was out in the light and air while they were being sucked down to death, and they were down there because he was up here. He knew it and they knew it, and he could see their knowledge in their faces. There was no reproach either in their faces or in their hearts. There was no reproach either in their faces or in their hearts, all in the knowledge that they must die in order that he must remain alive, and that this was part of the unavoidable order of things. He could not remember what had happened, but he knew in his dream that in some way the lives of his mother and his sister had been sacrificed to his own. It was one of those dreams which, while retaining the characteristic dream scenery, are a continuation of one's intellectual life, in which one becomes aware of facts and ideas which still seem new and valuable after one is awake. So basically he's having lucid dreams of his, not exactly his childhood, but of his mother and his sister. And he doesn't remember how they passed, but this is kind of like, it's like blending with his old reality and his dream reality. The thing that now suddenly struck Winston was that his mother's death nearly 30 years ago had been tragic and sorrowful in a way that was no longer possible. Tragedy, he perceived, belonged to the ancient time, to a time when there was still privacy, love, and friendship, and when the members of a family stood by one another without needing to know the reason. His mother's memory tore at his heart because she had died loving him, when he was too young and selfish to love her in return, and because somehow he did not remember how she had sacrificed herself to a conception of loyalty that was private and unalterable. Such things, he saw, could not happen today. Today there were fear, hatred, and pain, but no dignity of emotion or deep or complex sorrows. All this he seemed to see in the large eyes of his mother and his sister, looking up at him through the green water, hundreds of fathoms down, and still sinking. Suddenly he was standing on short springy turf on a summer evening when the slanting rays of the sun gilded the ground. The landscape that he was looking at recurred so often in his dreams that he was never fully certain whether or not he had seen it in the real world. In his waking thoughts he called it the Golden Country. It was an old rabbit-bitten pasture with a foot track wandering across it and a mole-hole here and there. In the ragged hedge on the opposite side of the field, the boughs of the elm trees were swaying very faintly in the breeze, their leaves just whirring in dense masses like women's hair. Somewhere near at hand, though out of sight, there was a clear, slow-moving stream where dace were swimming in pools under the willow trees. The girl with dark hair was coming toward him across the field. With what seemed a single movement, she tore off her clothes and flung them disdainfully aside. Her body was white and smooth, but it aroused no desire in him. Indeed, he barely looked at it. What overwhelmed him in that instant was admiration for the gesture with which she had thrown her clothes to the side. With its grace and carelessness, it seemed to annihilate a whole culture, a whole system of thought, as though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept into nothingness by the single splendid movement of the arm. That, too, was a gesture belonging to the ancient time. Winston woke up with the word Shakespeare on his lips. The telescreen was giving forth an ear-splitting whistle, which continued on the same note for 30 seconds. It was not 7:15, getting up time for office workers. Winston wrenched his body out of bed, naked, for a member of the outer party received only 3,000 clothing coupons annually, and a suit of pajamas was 600. So he's like, I'm going to sleep naked because y'all ain't giving me enough money to buy pajamas. He seized a dingy singlet and a pair of shorts that were laying across a chair. The physical jerks would begin in 3 minutes. The next moment he was doubled up in a violent coughing fit, which nearly always attacked him soon after waking up. It emptied his lungs so completely that he could only begin breathing again by lying on his back and taking a series of deep gasps. His veins had swelled with the effort of the cough, and the varicose ulcer had started itching. 30 to 40 group, yapped a piercing female voice. 30 to 40 group, take your places, please. 30s to 40s. Winston sprang to attention in front of the telescreen, upon which the image of a youngish woman, scrawny but muscular, dressed in tunic and gym shoes, had already appeared. Arms bending and stretching, she rapped out, take your time, by me. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Come on, comrades, put a bit of life into it. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The pain of the coughing fit had not quite driven out of Winston's mind the impression made by his dream, and the rhythmic movements of the exercise restored it somewhat. As he mechanically shot his arms back and forth, wearing on his face the look of grim enjoyment, which was considered proper during the physical jerks, he was struggling to think his way backward into the dim period of his early childhood. It was extraordinarily difficult. Beyond the late 50s, everything faded. When there were no external records that you could refer to, even the outline of your own life lost its sharpness. You remembered huge events which had quite probably not happened. You remembered the details of incidents without being able to recapture their atmosphere, and there were long blank periods to which you could assign nothing. Everything had been different then. Even the names of countries and their shapes on the map had been different. Airstrip 1, for instance, had not been called in those days. It had been called England or Britain. Though London he felt fairly certain had always been called London. So Airstrip 1, like nowadays, you know, there's like England and all that stuff. They just erased it. They just named it Airstrip 1. So there's no more Great Britain. There's no more England. There's just Airstrip 1 in London. because it's London, England. That don't make no sense. Because England is the country. And Great Britain is a country. I'm pretty sure. Don't quote me on that one. My geography is a little off. But that's creepy, though. They just kept London because they probably just liked how it sounds. Winston could not definitely remember a time when his country had not been at war. But it was evident that there had been a fairly long interval of peace during his childhood, because one of his early memories was of an air raid which appeared to take everyone by surprise. Perhaps it was the time when the atomic bomb had fallen on Colchester. He did not remember the raid itself, but he did remember his father's hand clutching his own as they hurried down, down, down into some place deep in the earth, round and round a spiral staircase which rang under his feet and which finally so wearied his legs that he began whimpering and they had to stop and rest. His mother, in her slow, dreamy way, was following along behind them. She was carrying his baby sister, or perhaps it was only a bundle of blankets that she was carrying. He was not certain whether his sister had been born then. Finally, they had emerged into a noisy, crowded place, which he realized was a tube station. So like a substation, like the subway, but underground. The subway is underground. Whatever. It's late. I'm tired. There were people sitting all over the stone flagged floor, and other people, packed tightly together, were sitting on metal bunks above one another. Winston and his mother and father found themselves a place on the floor, and near them an old man and an old woman were sitting side by side on a bunk. The old man had on a decent dark suit and a black cloth cap pushed back from very white hair. His face was scarlet and his eyes were blue and full of tears. He reeked of gin. It seemed to breathe out of his skin in place of sweat, and one could have fancied that the others welling from his eyes were pure gin. Like when people drink, he just smelled like straight liquor. And the sweat, he's sweating, smelled like liquor. And Winston's like, man, if he's crying tears of alcohol, bro. That's crazy. But though slightly drunk, he was also suffering under some grief that was genuine and unbearable. In his childish way, Winston grasped that something terrible, something that was beyond forgiveness and could never be remedied, had just happened. It also seemed to him that he knew what it was. Someone whom the old man loved, a little granddaughter perhaps, had been killed. Every few minutes the old man kept repeating. I tried to read that normally earlier and it just did not sound right in a normal accent, so I guess if I gave it a British accent, it sounded better. But my little British accent is a little... So we're going to try it again. We didn't ought to have trusted him. I said so, Ma, didn't I? That's what come of trusting him. I said so all along. We didn't ought to have trusted the buggers. But which buggers they didn't ought to have trusted, Winston could not now remember. Since about that time, war had been literally continuous, though strictly speaking, it had not always been the same war. For several months during his childhood, there had been confused street fighting in London itself, some of which he remembered vividly. But to trace out the history of the whole period, to say who was fighting whom at any given moment, would have been utterly impossible, since no written record and no spoken word ever made mention of any other alignment than the existing one. So he's saying the time period that they're in, that's the only one that he can think of or even remember. He can't remember any other time period or anything before that. Even though he has memories of it, he's been so stuck in this one that it's just faded away. At this moment, for example, in 1984, if it was 1984, Oceania was at war with Eurasia and in alliance with East Asia. In no public or private utterance was it ever admitted that the three powers had at any time been grouped along different lines. Actually, as Winston well knew, it was only 4 years since Oceania had been at war with East Asia and in alliance with Eurasia. But there was merely a piece of furtive knowledge which he happened to possess because his memory was not satisfactorily under control. Officially, the change of partners had never happened. Oceania was at war with Eurasia. Therefore, Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia. The enemy of the moment always represented absolute evil, and it followed that any past or future agreement with him was impossible. The frightening thing he reflected for the 10,000th time as he forced his shoulders painfully backward. With hands on hips, they were gyrating their bodies from the waist, an exercise that was supposed to be good for the back muscles. The frightening thing was that it might all be true. If the party could thrust its hands into the past and say of this or that event, it never happened, that surely was more terrifying than mere torture and death. If the party could thrust its hands into the past and say of this or that event, it never happened, that surely was more terrifying than mere torture or death. So if the party could reach back into history and be like, nah, that didn't even happen. I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, that has to be worse than death, because how do you know anything? Like, how do you have any recollection of any memory you've ever had in your entire life? If they can just look back and be like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. That never happened. Like when I was saying in the first video about, I was telling you my teacher how I started off the story, or us reading the story, was he was asking who was George Washington, and we're like, that's the first president of the United States. And he's like, well, how do you know he's the first president? And it's like, because that's what you taught us. That's what he's saying right here. Because of what he's been taught, he doesn't know anything different. They can go back and be like, George Washington, who's George Washington? We don't know who that is. But y'all taught us he's the first president of the United States. No, we didn't. We didn't tell you that. We don't know who that is. You made that up. I don't even know a George Washington. Who is George Washington? That's nuts. The party said that Oceania had never been in alliance with Eurasia. He, Winston Smith, knew that Oceania had been in alliance with Eurasia as short a time as 4 years ago. But where did that knowledge exist? Only in his own consciousness, which in any case must soon be annihilated. And if all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, when the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past, ran the party slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present, controls the past. And yet the past, though of its nature alterable, never had been altered. That's a bar right there. Who controls the past, controls the future. And who controls the present, controls the past. And yet the past itself can never be altered, because it already happened. Ooh. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite simple. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Reality control, they called it in Newspeak. Doublethink. Stand easy, barked the instructors a little more genially. Winston sank his arms to his sides and slowly refilled his lungs with air. His mind slid away into the labyrinthine world of doublethink. To know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in both of them, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it, to believe that democracy was impossible and that the party was the guardian of democracy, to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then to draw it back into memory again at the moment when it was needed, and then promptly to forget it again, and above all, to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety. Consciously to induce unconsciousness, and then once again to become unconscious of the fact of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. The instructress had called them to attention again. And now let's see which of us can touch our toes, she said enthusiastically. Right arm over the hips. Please, comrades. 1, 2. 1, 2. Winston loved this exercise, which sent shooting pains all the way from his heels to his buttocks, and often ended by bringing on another coughing fit. The half-pleasant quality went out of his meditations. The past, he reflected, had not merely been altered, it had been actually destroyed. For how could you establish even the most obvious fact when there existed no record outside your own memory? He tried to remember in what year he had first heard mention of Big Brother. He thought it must have been at some time in the 60s, but it was impossible to be certain. In the party histories, of course, Big Brother figured as the leader and guardian of the revolution since its very earliest days. His exploits had been gradually pushed backwards in time until already they extended into the fabulous world of the 40s and the 30s, when the capitalists in their strange cylindrical hats still rode through the streets of London in great gleaming motor cars or horse carriages with glass sides. There was no knowing how much of this legend was even true and how much invented. Winston could not even remember at what date the party itself had come into existence. He did not believe that he had ever heard the word Ingsoc before 1960, but it was possible that in its old speak form, English socialism, that is to say, it had been current earlier. Everything melted into mist. Sometimes, indeed, you could put your finger on a definite lie. It was not true, for example, as was claimed in the party history books, that the party had invented airplanes. He could remember airplanes since his earliest childhood, but you could prove nothing. Damn. They talking about, hey, yo, we invented airplanes. And he's like, no, y'all didn't. There was planes alive when I was alive, or when I was a kid. There have been planes. Y'all didn't invent these. But you could prove nothing. There was never any evidence. Just once in his whole life, he had held in his hands unmistakable documentary proof of this falsification of a historical fact. And on that occasion, Smith! Screamed the shrewer's voice from the telescreen. 6079 Smith, W. Yes, you. Bend lower, please. You can do better than that. You're not trying. Lower, please. That's better, comrade. Now stand at ease, the whole squad, and watch me. A sudden hot sweat had broken out all over Winston's body. His face remained completely inscrutable. Never show dismay. Never show resentment. A single flicker of the eyes could give you away. He stood watching while the instructress raised her arms over her head, and one could not say gracefully, but with remarkable neatness and efficiency, bent over and tucked the first joint of her fingers under her toes. There, comrades, that's how I want to see you doing it. Watch me again. I'm 39 and I've had 4 children. Now look. She bent over again. You see my knees aren't bent? You can all do that if you want to, she added as she straightened herself up. Anyone under 45 is perfectly capable of touching his toes. We don't all have the privilege of fighting in the front line, but at least we can all keep fit. Remember our boys on the Malabar front, and the sailors in the floating fortresses. Just think what they have to put up with. Now try again. That's better, comrade. That's much better, she added encouragingly as Winston, with a violent lunge, succeeded in touching his toes with knees unbent for the first time in several years. So as he's having all these thoughts come in his head in these moments, he's like zoning out during their daily morning workouts or whatever. They plugged into his screen and seen him. And it's like, you're not bending good enough. You need to go lower. You're not even trying. So while he's, like in the first chapter, when he's like, you never know when they can plug into your wire and see what you're doing in your home through the telescreens. That's literally what they're doing right now while he's working out. They plugged into his screen, y'all, and seen that he was not touching his toes where he needed to touch his toes. Like, that's how involved in his life, in their life, in this society that they are. That is wild. Girl, why are you watching me work out? You're supposed to be the instructor. You're supposed to be doing what you're doing. Why are you worried about what I'm doing? And the fact that even if I'm not doing it up to your standards, you can literally plug into my screen. So that's like me right now. If I was not reading this book accurately enough, they could be like, you need to read better. I could get like a Siri right now and be like, hey, you not reading this book accurately. You need to tell it how it is. That is creepy. That's creepy. That's like my TV right now. I don't know why, but I turned it off before I started reading this because I think it's a little weird. It gives me a little anxiety sometimes, but they could literally turn on right now and just watch me. That is wild. Because he was not touching his toes the way she wanted him to touch his toes. She plugged into this man's screen. His screen. This TV that's watching him. That is nuts. So that's the end of chapter 3. But that's just so crazy to me because it's just like they're literally, and as we get deeper into the book, it makes more sense of how he knows. Like he said he held historical proof in his hands before of them changing history, and even how he's like, y'all talking about y'all invented planes, but there have been planes since I was a child. Like he can't even remember his own childhood all the way or the timelines of everything that's happened because they have come in and they have changed so many things that he feels like he's going crazy. Like when he's talking about how he's seen that what is it? That field that he's running in, like with the trees and all that stuff. Because remember, in the beginning, everything's like desolate now. Like it got bombed. It's just rubbish and potholes everywhere. It's dark. It's dim. It's gloomy. There's like no light. The air is so polluted that there's no sunlight. But he's seen this field and like this not fortress. Lord, what word am I thinking of? He's seen this field. And he's like, I don't know if it's real or if it's a figment of my imagination, if I dreamed it. But it's probably something from his childhood that he's seen. Or like how he doesn't even remember how his parents passed away. I mean, they passed away when he was a child, yes. But it's just like, how do you not remember your parents passing away? Regardless of what age you are, I think you'd remember that. But he's like, he's seen his sister and his mother drowning. That's his dream mixing in with his reality. He doesn't remember how they died, but he remembers seeing them go down, down, down. He doesn't even remember his father, how his father died. Like, that's crazy. But that's the end of chapter 2 and 3 for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you want to join in on the conversation, like we could have some discussion about this. If you want to leave some comments in the comment section and put your thoughts and opinions onto the story, and then hopefully we can like form a rapport or like a discussion for whenever we finish a chapter, so I can go through all the old comments and then implement them into the story, because I like that, like discussion, people form their opinions and send in their opinions. I think that'd be really nice. But yeah, hope everybody has a blessed rest of their weekend. Today is Friday. Yeah, it's Friday. It's almost midnight though, so it's almost Saturday. So everybody have a blessed weekend, and I hope you guys enjoyed the story.